The original Friday the 13th was actually an independently produced flick. It was picked up by Paramount after someone from the studio saw a screening of the movie. So when it came time for a now studio-produced sequel, it was a given that it was going to have a bigger budget and a slightly more professional feel. One of the original concepts behind Friday the 13th movies was that every movie was going to be a different horror story that happened on Friday the 13th. The same as the original concept of the Halloween movies and what they tried to do with Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Luckily for this franchise, the studio wanted to go in a different direction. Fans had loved the surprise appearance of Jason at the end of the first movie, and even though it had only meant to be a gag, a rip-off of the jump scare ending to the movie Carrie, it was decided that a vengeful son would take up the mantle of antagonist. The second film is set in a summer camp for summer camp counselors. That is also on the shores of Crystal Lake, for some reason. A new gaggle of horny teens have come to learn all the finer points of being kill fodder by the proprietor of the camp, Paul, and his young assistant slash uncomfortably young girlfriend, Ginny. Around the campfire, Paul tells his kids the slightly retconned legend of Jason Voorhees and how he will attack anyone trespassing on the now condemned Camp Crystal Lake grounds. This means that a couple of the counselors instantly try to get there but are pulled away by the cops. Paul offers to give the kids one last night on the town before the real work begins and the group splits. Some go off drinking at some strange family restaurant type place, while the others stay back to couple up and get to some tender lovin'. Jason wastes no time and starts picking the kids off one by one until Paul and Jenny return home to face him. Ginny escapes into the woods where she comes across Jason's dilapidated shanty and his creepy shrine, his mother's literal head surrounded by the bodies of his former victims. Luckily, it was set up earlier that she has an interest in child psychology, so she pulls on Mrs. Voorhees' terrible knitted sweater and does her best impersonation to temper Jason's murderous rampage until Paul comes in for the save. But just as they think they've beaten the brute, Jason grabs Ginny through the window and it fades to white. The movie closes out with Ginny being rescued but Paul nowhere in sight. It was quite obvious that this movie had more money to play around with and better resources, as the overall production quality is noticeably better than the first movie, but it definitely does lose that slightly darker edge and more suspenseful quality of its predecessor. While not memorable, the kids in this one do have a little more to them and are slightly easy to tell apart. This may be the first time a wheelchair-bound character appears, and is desperately trying to avoid the blatant sexual advances of a beautiful girl, and getting a machete to the face and falling down a flight of stairs. Diversity, yay! Well, not really to do with anything, I did find it strange that we're introduced to this guy, a gangly ginger nerd with the words dead meat figuratively tattooed on his forehead. As soon as I saw him, I just couldn't wait to see this annoyingly lanky geek meet his grisly fate. But he kinda disappears entirely in the middle of the movie. It's like the screenwriter set up this character, but then completely forgot about his existence. The kill variety is fairly standard, with the majority of victims getting offed with a simple knifing. There is a famous kill where Jason uses a spear to double impale a copulating couple, but the actual penetration of the spear, you pervert, had to be cut to avoid the movie receiving an X rating. I did really enjoy that Jason's first victim is actually the local town nuisance Crazy Ralph from the first movie. He turns up to give his usual doom warning, but is garroted by Jason before he can. In terms of sexual escapades, this movie does feature an increased number of flustered couples, but most of them do get killed off before they can satisfy their urges. It does contain one scene where a female counselor strips off and goes for a late night swim, a scene that is credited as the starting point of the slasher trope that any character that goes skinny dipping is doomed to die shortly after. A full frontal nude scene was apparently shot of one of the actresses before the studio learned she was underage and burned all the evidence. Whoops. Actress Adrienne King, who played sole survivor Alice in the first movie, was apparently stalked by an obsessive Friday fan after the success of the first film, so decided to take a break from acting, appearing in this one only long enough for Jason to take his vengeance by hiding a head in the fridge and giving her a nice pick to the skull. As this is the first time Jason is the antagonist, I have to point out he isn't quite yet the Jason Voorhees he will eventually become. His existence in the story really doesn't make any sense. It is said that Jason seeks revenge on anyone entering his turf after witnessing his mother's decapitation, But his mother only went around killing people in revenge for his death. If Jason didn't actually drown, did Mrs. Voorhees know this? If so, why did she bother slaughtering camp counselors 21 years later? If she didn't know, what was Jason doing all this time? Was he really just hanging out in the lake? And if so, would he really care that much about a woman he has had next to no contact for 2 decades? Later films would give some explanations for this plot hole, but at the time, Jason's reintroduction to the story angered some people, including the original director, who left the film after feeling Jason's inclusion was, well, stupid. Jason has not yet discovered his legendary love of hockey goalkeeper masks, so in this one he runs around with a pillowcase on his head, and a single eye hole cut out, which would have done wonders for his depth perception.
I take great exception to the scene in which we have just witnessed a man with a bag on his head, scaring and frightening children who are having a nice, happy time.
He is portrayed mostly as just a crazy guy. He still doesn't talk, but far from being the imposing juggernaut, he does a lot of scurrying and scrambling around, which is something later Jason doesn't do. Something I couldn't help but notice is that his outfit is remarkably clean and almost trendy. He could definitely get into a few inner city clubs dressed like that. Not bad for someone living in his own filth, sharing a shack made of garbage with a rotten human head. The ending of the movie is probably the worst thing about it, since it's almost like someone dropped the last page of the script in the lake before shooting and they didn't know what to do, so they just didn't do it. Paul and Ginny think they're safe, but Jason bursts through the glass to grab her. Then suddenly she's being loaded into an ambulance and can't see her boyfriend. That's a good question. Where is Paul? Did Jason get him? Why didn't he kill her? Did his running tackle fail somehow? It's one of those endings that's not really a mystery, it's just literally missing a scene to explain what the hell happened. People hoped that this would be explained in another sequel, and luckily they didn't have to wait long.